Okay, so welcome everyone. My name is Kiszka. Maybe you've seen me on the stage here before. For those who didn't, I'm happy to do open source for Siemens. Besides various things, I'm also maintaining a couple of open source projects. And today I would like to talk about what happens if you actually receive for one of these open source projects a vulnerability report. Primarily, but obviously also as a side effect, look into, well, how you would report some and what are the consequences can be on that. So first of all, start with a quick questionnaire. So who of you have ever caused a vulnerability that you're aware of while writing code? Come on, folks. There must be a lot of management here without ever touching software before.
That's really production count.
Okay. So my as well, of course. Did your vulnerability get a CVE assigned? Great. I had to look back. I remember one case which was from 2004. If you know Wireshark, then you also know Ethereal. I wrote once a dissector for that, and that actually caused a vulnerability. And I was kind of mixed proud, and now I have written important code apparently, but then also did anyone of you probably never requested a CVE? Well, you did. Oh, two, great. I didn't. So I'm talking about this today. And final question, who of you ever reported a vulnerability? Okay, that's even more. Good. So let's think about, first of all, what does it mean if you report a vulnerability? So how should you do that? Well, best practice today is coordinated vulnerability disclosure. That means responsible disclosure. Don't just go to the mailing list or to whoever channel and say, yeah, you're broken. This is probably security relevant and everyone can read it. No, the real approach is that you reach out privately to the responsible persons and to give them some time to fix the problem, to understand and fix it properly. Well, if it's a commercial product, it's kind of simple. Conceptually, at least, you go for the vendor. What do you do if it's an open source project? Well, the natural thing would be, well, there's a maintainer probably somewhere. Maybe he has an email address or she. Try that. Maybe there are private issues, tickets available, something like this, other channels. So it can be quite complicated in that sense. And actually the story started for me again after 2004. I thought this is not a topic, but in the end, actually what happened in the past 2 years, we received quite a few bug reports for things which are somehow Siemens associated, stronger or less strong, via our product cert. Why? Good question. Maybe it's because there's a button to click on for people to find something in code which has some Siemens mentioning, or at least prominent Siemens mentioning. But yeah, that happened. And along that spun a discussion about how to do that properly. What does it mean that an open source project is affiliated with a company like us? We are not alone with that, but still, how should we deal with that? So is it a good idea, and when is it a good idea to take a report via product channels, official corporate product channels? Well, there are pros and cons. Pros, obviously, is if it's an open source project which is really tied to a company, to a product line of a company, like an SDK as open source to your product, that probably is a good association. But otherwise, also keep in mind if it's a real open source project, so it's not really tight in that sense. Going via that channel may actually involve additional delays. So it may not be the optimal path. Another thing that I also thought about, is, do I really want to have this open source project strictly assigned or affiliated with Siemens? Should it be like that? Because that may actually evolve if you go that channel. It may actually happen that the company says, well, we should issue an official product security advisory. And that makes, my open source project, the Siemens product, has an issue. Here is the product advisory. If that is really desired, depends obviously on the open source project you are running, but in some cases it's not probably the desired path. So for me, that was the thing to think about, okay, we should probably not use this channel primarily. Because what is actually our open source project? What do we want to own in that sense? From a branding perspective, from a logical perspective. What if we actually want to avoid this appears to be like a Siemens-owned project? Because this could cause troubles for other contributors from different companies, competing companies, to say, yeah, we're not giving Siemens the code. We're giving it to the open source community. So this is actually something you want to possibly avoid in the appearance of your project. And also practical considerations, like well, currently I'm maybe employed with Siemens and doing this as a maintainer for an open source project. If I leave and take my project with me, so to say, my role with me, then I don't take the infrastructure with me. Also, if a project is handed over to a third party, because Siemens is no longer the strongest interest in the project and someone else takes over, it's also happened before with projects we run, how to hand over the infrastructure, give them access to our product cert. So yeah, this is the most flexible solution for that. So what do others do? Was my next question. Maybe there are good references. So the first thing I looked at, for whatever reason, was Microsoft. They do a lot of open source, great stuff. How do they handle that on their projects, which are running, in this case, on GitHub? What do they have there? Well, first appearance is very professional. So we have official channels there, well-documented processes, and on and so forth. At the same time, this all means that everything under that namespace is really appears as corporate-owned, as Microsoft-owned. So yeah, if that fits for some projects, it's fine. If it doesn't fit, well, then probably look to something else. Others, well, seem to have copied from Microsoft. So let's look at Google. What do they do? For their own projects, so which really are under their own domain, it's much leaner. It also uses own infrastructure. There's a central channel for everything. You can feed in the vulnerability reports. But then they actually explicitly say, we are then reporting the findings via the GitHub advisories. So there's a channel, apparently, which is not completely corporate operated. But I looked further, and then I saw, there's a recommendation of Google for open source projects. So how should you set up your reporting channels? What should you do? What should you think about? So this is the link to the small project with a few of templates, run books. So really have a look. If you're a maintainer, have a look what is written there. It's not a lot, but it's essential things. And it also kind of scales. If you're a small project, one guy, so to say, doing the development, being the maintainer, and very little contributors, this also fits still, up to larger projects. So part of that actually is looking into what do these Gitforges we run our code on, we host our code on, what provide us there already. So the first thing, well, we have GitHub/Siemens as a group for many Siemens projects. So maybe we can leverage something there. And that's actually the case. It's not completely long running yet, but still it's a beta program for enabling private vulnerability reporting. So that is, first of all, the channel to establish a clear path where you can drop off your vulnerability report. Something to easily enable, more or less. Click through the settings there. They also have some advices there. Well, obviously, if you want to develop around that report and at the end and fix, you can also create private forks from that. The other interesting feature they have there is this security advisory tool, where in the end you get out an advisory once everything is settled, fixed, and should then be reported to your users. But you can prepare everything, obviously, in private before you actually go public. When you do this kind of assessment of a reported issue, you normally also do some kind of scoring for that. So how critical is the issue? Is it easily exploitable? Or does it really need certain extra privileges to make it critical? So you get the scoring number. There's a calculator for that, not invented by GitHub, but they are linking to that. So it's easy to come up with some rough estimation of the criticality of the issue, which obviously also helps your user to assess if this is really something they should quickly fix. Another important thing, as I mentioned, the topic of CVEs before. So this common vulnerability and exposure numbering system where you have kind of implicit visibility if you have a number for your project. Getting something like this, well, it's obviously possible with our own channels. So product set obviously is able to issue these kind of CVE numbers, and they actually also offered it for doing that for our open source projects. But once again, if you want to be independent, you can also look for other channels, and GitHub is one of those who issue, so to say, or who request the CVE numbers on your behalf as an open source project. That's part of this process. You can click on it. I didn't do, because in the end, that concrete issue I was showing here turned out to be not really an issue in the sense that it's worth to report. But if you have such kind of case, you can click through that and you get the CVE number, which also implies that you gain implicitly, not just, so to say, to your direct users following you on your primary channels, but also indirectly via redistributions, via other portals, the visibility, okay, there is an issue for a component that I'm using in my products. We know this also from our vulnerability portal, where we get also the feed-in of these kind of numbers. And if you have a match between a product using a component and a CVE, well, you get a notice. So this is happening apparently not only for us, but also for other companies. So this is a valuable thing to consider if you really have something worth to fix, to request also that number. So there's a link for the documentation to look further. So GitHub is one channel. What are the others? Quickly check through what Gitlab is offering. Specifically, well, first of all, the channel here is a little bit different. Well, you can just mark an issue private, and then you have, so to say, your private channel. That's one possibility. I didn't find something equivalent to the advisory reporting. Maybe I was blind, but feel free to point it out to me. But I didn't see something like this. Nevertheless, also Gitlab is a CNA, so a CVE numbering authority, so they can also request on your behalf a CVE number if you have something worth to report. Basically, this appears if you have a private issue, you press this button and you can click on it, and it opens up another issue, a request issue, so to say, with the Gitlab operators, and they will then assess your reporting and do the next necessary steps. Yeah, exactly. That's basically the infrastructure there. I looked a little bit further, but maybe other information for other forges are still out there. The Giti one, Chinese one, didn't find anything, but maybe I couldn't just pass the language. SourceForge, I don't know, still exists. Maybe others have the same. But actually, if you are an open source project, it's at least worth to have one of these GitLab or GitHub mirrors or channels as well, just to have this option to get the reporting and the CVE numbering that way. And we actually discussed it for a project recently, which doesn't have that as a primary home, but has a mirror, an official mirror on GitHub, to use that channel then also to get a CVE number when needed. So this is a nice option to have. So now look also on another important aspect I want to point out here. That's defining, so to say, your security policy. That's again a pattern that Google was suggesting, and that also that GitHub is picking up prominently. So just like you have a README with your open source project, you may have a contributing guide. You probably have a license, I hope so, a license document. You can have a security file as well. And that is picked up by GitHub prominently if you click on security on a rated project, and shows basically what you've written there. What you've written there is free text, but there should be some structure behind it. At least this is what I learned here and also extended a little bit. So the suggested template that I'm now using consists of, well, some general introduction. Feel free to just copy it. Some section actually I introduced, which I find quite important. That's what I call security context. Maybe there's a better name for that, but anyway, the idea behind this, if you have an open source project, well, you can use it for different purposes, obviously. And some people use things for completely different things that are made for originally. So the idea is to explain from your perspective as the community, the open source project, to your users what your intended or envisioned security-related usage could be. So that there might not be misunderstandings from the beginning, also for vulnerability reporters, yeah, this is not really in scope for us. You can do that, but we don't support you on that. And therefore, yeah, be careful with that. So that security context should roughly explain what you consider to be in scope for the security aspects of your project. And maybe also some things which may appear like in scope, but actually obviously aren't from your perspective for whatever reason. That, again, that can help both your users, but also vulnerability reporters to get an understanding what they just found or what they just should use the project for. And then the even more important section, obviously, is how you establish or you want to establish the reporting channel, just to avoid that someone is running around and trying to find the right channel, which actually happened with a couple of our projects. And that's also the reason why the product set was contacted in the end. Researchers are sometimes very good in finding, or they're often very good in finding the vulnerabilities. They're not always very good in finding the maintainer for whatever reason. So this is the chance basically to give them a channel. So either we are one of these Forges private channels, or you put an email address, or you put both. We did both for some of our projects, so that you have kind of a backup for that. And also define along that what's your intended response time to any of these reports and your disclosure timeline, so that you give yourself some time, and 90 days is kind of standard minimum, to not just take the report, but also look into it, understand it, and so on and so forth, and finally fix and inform the users. So I put some examples here. I hope there will be more in the future. Actually, I want to have more before, but yeah, I still have to write some of the patches and merge requests for other projects as well. So some general advices from the maintainer perspective. So if you receive a report, please make sure that the channels you are providing has a quick response time, in the sense, okay, yep, got it, we will look into that. That would be important. Otherwise, the reporter may run around or even decide, okay, they're not reacting, let's publish it simply. However, what you do not have to do immediately is to say, yeah, this is completely right, completely broken. Give it the time, look at it. It may not appear as it is on the first sight. So this is nothing you have to do immediately to hectically report or confirm that this is a real issue. Take the time to assess, to reproduce, to discuss, also with other trusted people of your community. It's also something I learned in the process. You may then pick up too quickly the view of the reporter, and you talk to another guy, and they said, yeah, but they think about this, and is this actually an issue? If you do that, it's also probable. So yeah, take a time to have the internal discussion with an inner circle, so to say, of your project. Involve the reporter as well, just to avoid that they will see this differently in the end, or that they have further aspects to report on top that they didn't do in the initial report. So this is also important. And obviously also in the end to give them the proper credit for that. Fix should be prepared privately. Don't be hectic on that. There have been a lot of fixes issued in the past which actually made certain things better and other things even worse. Just discussing with one of our suppliers that we tried to improve something and actually caused an even bigger bug this way. So take your time to look into that and discuss it again with an inner circle before you rush out forward with a fix, and then obviously also the announcement for that. And one further aspect to think about, if you got this report, look left and right if the pattern you found or the concrete point maybe appears multiple times in your project line. Or maybe also the use case that was now presented from the reporter is something you never thought about so far, but is valid from your perspective. Also, then it's worth to reconsider basically your code base, your architecture in that light, and see if there are further of that kind of issues. So, closing thoughts quickly. Check, first of all, again, if your open source project should gain this kind of security MD. Have a look at the examples, and I can really recommend to at least establish the reporting channel. We at Siemens should think about if we want to have this kind of, or a kind of default security MD. So Google is doing that, Microsoft is doing it as well. It has some pros, obviously. It defines the fallback if your project is not defining it. The con, it can be overwritten, obviously, as well. But the con is, yeah, maybe it also, our forks of public project will suddenly begin that kind of security channel, and we may get then kernel bug reports, I don't know. Well, that's the side effect, so to say. And don't forget in the end to harden your projects, obviously. Run the security scanners, like the secret scanners Roger mentioned. Look for audited dependencies. This also can be automated widely. So source of vulnerabilities you can get in. Secure, obviously, your code access or your code upload path if you're a maintainer even more. So work in trusted infrastructure so that you have non-zero trust in your environments, obviously. 2FA and things like this, common recommendations. And have a look also at the best practices of the core infrastructure project. There's a long checklist you can do. Look at it. Don't get demotivated. I got initially when I looked at all the stuff. So it's a kind of checklist. You can interpret certain things. You should not necessarily do all of that things literally, but it's a good guidance to see, okay, where can I improve the security of my supply chain in the end? And yeah, maybe you can even gain a badge. But honestly, I think some of these badges are more like, oh yeah, I really have to get this badge and make it yes and make it the other way interpreted. So yeah. Anyway, that's my take on that. Happy to take any questions on that or any further suggestions and thoughts on this. I'm around here, also happy to discuss these aspects. So thank you for your attention. There's a question. Yeah.
Thanks. How does it work when, let's say, there's a bit of urgency where the researcher wants to present their findings at some public conference like, was it CCC, Chaos Computer Club, end of the year? How does that dynamic work? Because, they do want there's a lot of conversation, but then...
I mean, to be fair, it's a kind of informal contract between you as the operator of the project and the reporter about this disclosure time. So you should be given that 90 days. So if they come up 9 days before they want to present it with a vulnerability and then expect you to react in 9 days and do the whole process, I don't think this is fair. So from that perspective, they should come up earlier. This is normally what also happens. I mean, if they see, okay, there is an issue, it's critical, plan for the receiving entity to process and then fix the issue and then have some publication of that. Sometimes they even grant you more than 90 days if you at least start to discuss with them. But I wouldn't expect that they will push down you, at least if they are serious following this the responsible disclosure process on the timeline. I mean, if you can manage it, you can agree on doing it quicker. But again, this is, I think, the freedom they have to give you and the time you have to give you to react responsibly to that report.
Okay. And if there's no communication and they do present, because sometimes you see this, how do they protect their legality that, okay, I exposed a vulnerability, I talk about it now, and I had zero communication?
I'm not a lawyer, but I think there are here some in the room. Yeah, is this actually critical? I know it from a friend of mine who had some findings in German cable TV systems that he actually didn't go directly for publishing that. In the end, he had a talk at Chaos Communication on that topic, but he went via a magazine, a German magazine, and had them as proxy, so to say. They were publishing the first information about it, not him. Afterwards, he basically sat on stage until that was clear, but what's happening afterwards. So they sometimes look, if you don't do this for profession or you don't have this legal advice on how to do it properly, you can actually hide or get the protection of these kind of channels as well, which happens sometimes, yeah.
Maybe just some legal advice for 2 cents. We are currently saying do not publish too early, because basically that means that everyone else can exploit the vulnerability. Yeah. So, and exactly. Also we're usually not required to. And we're right now trying to tell the salespeople in the countries to not give too many warranties for the security of the products we have out there, which is a difficult thing to do, but we're trying hard.
Yeah, I mean, this is actually also the interesting perspective I think we have now as company doing open source, where you sometimes have a different view on that. In the end, there is no security without transparency, as we know, but also having the responsibility as a company. So what we are publishing as open source, we may also consume as open source and may be part of our product. So I think this is actually, as you pointed out, this is a complicated thing. But in the end, again, I'm talking here from the open source perspective. And there, really, in the end, we want to have a fix, obviously, and we want to have some responsible disclosure also of the information behind it. Because you see that the kernel has some interesting view on that as well. CVEs, we don't use CVEs in the kernel. Others do for the kernel. In the end, every bug can be a security exploiter. And if you look at the fixes which end up in the end in the tree, you will find the reasons behind it if you are sufficiently skilled in that. So being transparent in the nature of open source, you cannot really hide things. You can try to make the commit look weird, which in itself also is a weird thing. And colleagues of us from the research university did some study on kernel patches who didn't went the normal path of submitting things. So they end up kind of suddenly in the tree. Obviously, all of them were most of them. Well, there's some were actually just a mistake of the material, but many of them were actually the security issues. So you have a very clear signal without having the tag on it. This is a security topic. Be careful. So yeah, it's a problem that, and you can't really hide things there. Silently fix. People will notice this in open source. So if you have to publish it anyway, you want to publish it anyway, then you can also provide the information from the technical perspective. Is the right way to do.